All right. Perfect. We are now recording. Okay, I'm going to pull up the chat. I'll check it briefly periodically throughout today's course. Please put things in there if you have a question, or just feel free to jump in. So this is the basic cataloging refresher class. I'm Lauren Kelley. If we haven't met before, thanks for joining me today. It's very wonderful to have people interested in cataloging together. Very exciting, and it's exciting that we're having this cataloging month with events throughout the month on various topics. So today we're going to be going through MARC records. That may be a new term for some, maybe not for others. We're going to go through the basic fields, and then we're going to talk about copy cataloging. All right, let's start with the basic question of what is a MARC record? A MARC record, MARC stands for Machine Readable Cataloging Record. And this image that's on the right here talks about what a card catalog used to look like. The physical cards, I remember learning about them in kindergarten. I'm sure many others in this meeting have had a larger exposure to card catalogs than I did. But basically a MARC record, when we talk about it now, we're talking about the framework for organizing bibliographic information. And the way that we see MARC now is numerical. So we'll get into numerical fields, spend a lot of time with them today throughout the session. And when we talk about machines in the machine readable cataloging record, we're talking about computers. So really all of these numbers and little symbols that we'll see today are all about making this information about some material readable for a computer. And I'll use the acronym ILS quite a bit, also known as the catalog. That stands for Integrated Library System. It's the modern cataloging database that we all interact with and put MARC records into. And there's a great Library of Congress definition here that the MARC formats are standards for the representation and communication of bibliographic and related information in machine readable form. So once again, computer based. We live in this wonderful digital age. So when it comes to another acronym that I'm going to be using quite a bit, RDA, that stands for Resource Description and Access. This came along in 2010 as a result of more than a decade-long project. A group of people put it together. They wanted to improve this other set of rules. And this was put together by the Joint Steering Committee. This is a very brief overview today. We get a little bit more into the history in the CE class for the certification program. So I'm definitely abridging all of this information today for us. But basically, these rules that were previously put in place for cataloging really didn't take advantage of the internet and the fact that we can link data. We can tie things together in different ways because it's all digital. So back in 2010, Chris Oliver of the University of Ottawa, who is the author of Introducing RDA, A Guide to the Basics, explained that RDA demands precise data. So that's really the reason for rules. Precise data equals machine readable data. We want it uniform. We want to be able to share things really easily and have computers be able to process it in the same way. So RDA and before that, AACR2 are rules about how to express a book. So this is really what elements of the material should be represented. And these are rules that, you know, we can all agree on. This is important about a material that needs to be communicated and shared. And then MARC, the machine readable cataloging record, is the framework for cataloging that data. So RDA is kind of the what, and MARC is the kind of how, the fields for the elements, where they go, how they should be laid out, in what order. So today we're going to be going over this question of what kind of bibliographic and related information from that definition do we want to represent and communicate? This is RDA tells us this. We have the author, the title, the publisher, the year of the item, the page length, and the height. These are kind of basic elements that make a really good record. They're unique enough and identifiable. And where are these elements found? On the title page. That's really going to be kind of the most important place to look on a physical item. And then also the verso page, so the flip side of that, the publication page is also a way that it's referred to. That'll give you the publisher, the year, and then page length. Something that tricks people up sometimes is that for page length, you always want to record what you see on the item, even if there's like 3 pages after the last page that has the number printed on it, you go with what's printed. And then as far as the height, when you record that, you want to use centimeters and you want to round up. Now, where do these things go in a MARC record? Your author is going to go in field 100, or if it's a corporation, which is definitely a rarer instance, it'll go in the 110 field. Where does the title go? It goes in the 245 field. Where does the publisher go? 264, as well as the year. The page length is going to go in 300 and the height is going to go in 300. And that may sound a little nebulous at the moment, but hopefully by the end of the day, you'll understand what I mean when I say field 300. When it comes to fields, they are specifically formatted. Like I said before, it's so that computers can understand what the information that's being presented is and means. So there are these content designators is what they're called, things that the computer can understand. So there's a numerical tab or tag, excuse me, and then there's the indicators, and then there's a delimiter and a subfield. So the numerical tag is the first thing that you'll see, and it's a three-digit number specifically for an element. Some of these are repeatable. And in the MARC 21 handbook, which I'll be referencing quite a bit today, that's going to be like cataloger's best friend online. Things will be noted with an R or an NR if they're repeatable or non-repeatable. And then the indicators are the next thing that come. And these are 2 spaces. They are individual spaces that follow the numerical tag. And they're 1-digit codes, or you'll often see a # hashtag for null, meaning data not applicable. And then comes a delimiter. This is a character, sometimes represented by any of the 4 or even more characters there that show that a new element of information is coming. So that may look a little different depending on what system you use, what documents you look at, but it's just something for the computer to recognize, okay, new piece of information. And then the subfield follows the delimiter closely. And this is a letter or a number that represents different information components. Some may not be applicable to every field, but some are repeatable as well. Once again, they'll be notated R or NR. That's a lot of information, but there's more information to come. So with indicators and subfields, they change meaning depending on the numerical tag, just as each numerical tag means a different thing. Both the indicators and the delimiters are information for computer processing. So they look a little funky. They're not very intuitive because it's really so that the computer can understand what this information means. And then with subfields, I want to point out that punctuation matters. And with current cataloging practices, we always want to expand abbreviations. Unless it's centimeters, that always stays cm. And when it comes to a full MARC record, typically a good MARC record, you can use about 10% of the numerical tags. You don't have to use all of them. So even though there is like a 700 field, You may not use it. We're not going to go over it today. I tried to limit the amount of MARC fields that we're going to talk about today, just really keeping it basic. These are the important ones. If you have a good grasp of these ones, you can copy catalog much easily or much more easily. So we're going to be talking about the 020 field, which is ISBN, 040, specifically subfield D, which is the institution code, meaning who's doing cataloging work on this record. We're going to be talking about 100 or 110, that's for the author. We're going to be talking about the 245 field, which is the title. And then we'll talk about the 264 field, which has publishing and copyright information. 300 is the description field, which has height and the page number. And then there are some kind of tricky things to think about with 336, 337, and 338. But we'll get into detail about what those things mean, about the different types, content, media, and carrier. An optional field, all the ones that are marked in yellow are kind of an optional field depending on your need and ability. So the 520 is a summary of the item. We're going to get into subject headings a little bit. Usually we'll see these 3 times in a good record, and these are for subject headings go in the 650 field. And then another optional field, only if it's applicable, is the 700 or the 710, which is other contributor. And we'll get into what that means. All right, so starting with kind of the first field that is really crucial, especially with shared catalogs. Excuse me for 1 second, I have a frog in my throat. So we're talking about the ISBN. Some people call it the ISBN. It's the serial number that is unique to the item. And typically, these are a repeatable field because there is both a 10-digit and a 13-digit ISBN for one particular item. There are null indicators for this field. And the subfield Q is an important one because it can state whether it's a paperback copy or a hardcover copy. And now on each slide that I've put together, there will be this link down here to the MARC 21 handbook, and that gives examples. It states all of the rules, and then it spells out all the rules with examples. The MARC 21 handbook really is the best guide there is in terms of trying to understand what this field is for, how to use it, and to see examples. So here's an example here of a book, Michael Crichton's Dragon Teeth. And so this is part of the larger MARC record. And we have the numerical tag here, 020. This is in Verso that we're looking at. That's what the state uses for an ILS. And a lot of cataloging comes down to knowing how your ILS works, being able to understand what it presents to you in terms of how the fields are presented, what comes baked in when you put a quick record together. These 2 dots represent that these are null spaces. Typically, you'll see a pound or a hashtag. Verso uses these dots. This aspect of the information is not applicable to this field. And then we have the A subfield, and that is where the ISBN number has been input. And then there's a Q for clarification that this is in fact a hardcover copy of the book. We're doing good. Nothing in the chat yet. Okay, so let's move on to the next important field, which is where the author name goes. So for the 100 field, This is pulled right from the MARC 21 handbook, main entry, personal name. So this is for one specific author. And if you're unsure about how to write the author, usually it's last name, comma, first name, goes into the A field. But if there's anything that should go in the subfield D for dates associated with a name, that'll be listed in the Library of Congress Name Authority database, which I've linked here. It's really helpful to make sure that you are pointing out a specific person. The more clear you can be, the better the data, basically. And so when it comes to the main entry personal name, you'll see there's an NR, so it's non-repeatable. But Lauren, what if there's a book that has multiple authors? I'm glad you asked. If there's multiple authors, typically there's a rule about you really don't want to list more than 3, but obviously it depends on the book itself. But you're always going to put the first person listed in that 100 field, and then you'll use the 700 field for the 2 additional authors. Or if it's an author and an illustrator, put the author in the 100 and the illustrator in the 700. So these 2 fields are pretty far apart in terms of where the data comes, but they are kind of linked together in a way where there's the main author and then there's other contributor. That could be another author. Subfield E in both of these fields lets us know how the name relates to the work. So for the subfield E, if you have one author, you would write author there. And that is repeatable because sometimes an author is also an illustrator. So you could repeat that and then list illustrator as well. Perfect. 700 is here as well. Like we can see, subfield D and subfield E work in the same way as in the 100, dates associated realtor term. And when it comes to a corporate name, you don't see those quite as much, especially working in public libraries. But there is a field for that as well. It's 110, and really A is kind of the most important subfield for that. As you can see here, subfield D, it doesn't mean the same thing that it does in 100. It means date of meeting or treaty signing. So this is if like a corporate body got together and put something into place, that's where that would go. So you have to watch out for subfields meaning different things in different fields. So like I said, for author, that can go for illustrators and co-authors. Also, if there's an author of a foreword or introduction, you can write that in E. And if you notice, 700 is repeatable because you can have multiple authors, multiple illustrators. Those names are all going to get represented there. And the Library of Congress Name Authority database is also going to give you, the proper layout, what information, what maybe dates are associated with the name. And that database is here. It's also on the syllabus. And if anyone, I'll relink both the syllabus and the slides in an email with the recording from today. I'll send that out later today. So here's our example of dragon teeth, and this box here with weird looking characters and many dates. This is from the Library of Congress Name Authority database, and it gives us the personal name heading. So Crichton, comma, Michael comes that way. And then there are dates associated with this person. So this goes into subfield D. We have subfield E, he is an author. Notice the commas. Subfield A is Crichton. This does have different indicators. So let's go back to 100. So this is, first indicator is stating that the surname is coming first. And the second indicator holds no data reference. So that's why it's a 1. and then a space. Any questions so far? Feel free to stop me at any point or put anything in the chat. Oh, there are questions in the chat. Okay, so someone writes, how important is punctuation in these fields? Punctuation is important because we have to remember that we're working really for and with computers, and the computer will get thrown off by a comma versus a colon versus a semicolon, but it is depending on the field. So if you're not sure about punctuation, if you're making a record, if you're looking at a record, my go-to is the MARC 21 handbook, which has examples, or look at a record that you have already in the system, and a lot of cataloging is being able to decipher what's good about a record. So if you can find a good record, you can see, okay, I see there's a colon there. It'll be applicable to to my record that I'm working on as well. Another question that has been put into the chat is, what are other examples of relator term? Editor? Yes, editor is a great example of a relator term. The rules get tricky when it's an editor versus an author. I believe it does go into the 700. I'd have to double check on that. But author is typically what's going to show up in 100. But you could have, again, multiple relator terms if the author is also the editor, if it's also the illustrator. All of those terms can be represented there. And I think there's probably more listed out in the MARC 21 handbook. All right, so let's talk about the title. The title is going to go in the 245 field. This is a non-repeatable field because typically something has one title. And you always want to refer to what it says exactly on the title page, not the cover. Sometimes there are discrepancies, especially when it comes to subtitles. Sometimes subtitles are represented differently on the cover of the book, or not there at all, but they could be there on the title page. You're always going to go with what's on the title page. And there's also proper capitalization, which is solely the first word gets capitalized, the rest stays lowercase. That may vary depending on different catalogs, but in most shared catalogs, that is the way to go. So when it comes to the rules, like I said, non-repeatable. The first indicator is typically going to be a 1 because this is a little tricky to explain. If it's a 0, no added entry, it kind of means that you, the cataloger, are supplying the title. It didn't come with a title, which many things we catalog are probably going to come with a title attached, and so it'll be a 1. That's an added entry if the title is there, and you're just copying over what the title is. The second indicator trips people up a lot in this field. 0 means there are no non-filing characters. And what we mean by non-filing characters is letting the computer know that there are characters and spaces that you need to skip when you search for an item. Typically, the is a word that is skipped. And if you have a title that starts with the, you're usually going to see in the indicator spaces a 1, and then the second indicator is going to be a 4, because that's the number of non-filing characters. So that's THE and the space. You want to tell the computer, please ignore those four spaces, those 4 characters that show up when you index an item. So that way, if someone types in, the Sound of Music, it's not searching for the, because as we know, the appears a lot, especially in titles, and you wouldn't want to pull up things that have the. Sometimes computers aren't as specific with their indexing, so we want to make sure that the less characters that are non-specific to the item that don't get searched as possible. That's a good thing. Only presenting the most important aspects of the data for the computer to take into consideration when indexing and searching. So the title, as written on the title page, is going to go in subfield A. If there is a subtitle after A, you're going to put just the title, a colon, and then subfield B is going to come and you'll do the remainder of the title followed by backslash. We'll look at an example in a minute. And then typically you'll see a subfield C, which is related to what's in 100. It's usually where the author is listed, but you want to write whatever is on the title page. So it could say by blah, blah, blah. You're going to write in subfield C by blah, blah, blah. And it may list author, editor, illustrator, all on the title page. You're going to put all of that information into subfield C. Let's take a look at an example. Okay, so for Dragon Teeth, I put the title page here because a novel is present on the title page, but not on the cover. So we have our 245 field, that's our title. We have an indicator of a 1, meaning I'm taking this title, I'm not making it up. It is attached to the item already. And then a 0 indicator, which means there's nothing to skip. Please start at D when you index this title. So we have here the D is capitalized in the subfield A, Dragon Teeth. Notice there's a colon and then a subfield B, a novel, and a slash because a novel, once again, appears on that title page. Then in C, solely Michael Crichton is written out. So we're just going to pop that in there. And that's really all we have to do based on that title page. Let's see, there's a title page. Okay, so I know my box might be small, but I'm looking at this book here, Radical Cataloging, Essays from the Front. This here says edited by K.R. Roberto, and then it says introduction by Sanford Berman. All of that information would go into field C, whereas this information may not be both represented because 100 is not repeatable. But anything that's on the title page is going to show up in that C field if it talks about author, illustrator, that kind of stuff. Now notice that there is publishing information on this title page that does not go into the 245. That gets left to a different field. It really just is title statement, if there's any subfield information, and then anything about what's the language? Statement of responsibility. Are there questions about that? Looking clear? Once again, there are more examples in the MARC 21 handbook. That's laid out very well. And we can look at that if there's time at the end of the day. So the publishing information, we noticed there was some at the bottom of the title page. Typically, when we see MARC records, we might see this kind of information in a 260 field, which is the previous set of rules, the AICR 2, which some catalogs still follow, but RDA is definitely more popular and current. But you can always see both, and that'll be a hybrid record that may have information in the 260 and the 264. It's not really a right or wrong situation. It's more dependent on what kind of cataloging you're doing and have agreed to. And there's further reading about kind of the history and the change to 264 at this link, if you're interested. So 264, once again, punctuation is really going to matter for this field. A always gets a colon, B always gets a comma, and we can dig into what those things mean after we talk about this is repeatable. Usually the first indicator is null. It is going to be either not applicable or the earliest. I don't think it's worth really getting into. You'll mostly see this as a null first indicator. The second indicator may vary depending on what information is present. Most typically, I think you'll see a 1, that's the publication date, but you'll often see a 4. Sometimes you'll see this 264 with a second indicator of a 1, followed by an A field and a B field. And then you'll see the 264 repeated with just the 4 as a second indicator, and then solely C, just pointing out this is the copyright date, which things can have a separate publication date that is different than the copyright date. Oftentimes, excuse me, oftentimes these are the same date, and whoops, if so, you can make a decision between which indicator is going to be most accurate. But our subfields here, A is the place of production, publication, distribution, or manufacture. This will also relate to what is in that second indicator slot. If it's a 1, definitely means it's going to be the place of publication. Subfield B is the name of producer, publisher, distributor, manufacturer. If we go back to our title page, we can see that it's Harper. New York is the first location, probably most applicable to us cataloging in the United States. But the date of production, publication, distribution, that's not listed on the title page. You always want to check the publication or the verso page on the other side of the title page for this data overall, for the place, the name, and the date. It's not always accurate to rely just on what's there, especially with like older and rarer items. But it really depends on the item. So here are some examples. 264, 1, so this is the distribution. Wow. New York, typically if it is a big city, you do not have to list the state if it's New York or Boston. Toronto's also like that, because generally in the publishing world, we know where these places are. London. And then in the B subfield, we have Harper. Now on the publication or verso page, it probably wrote an imprint of HarperCollins Publishers. So that's why that information is included as well. It really depends on what you see on the page. And then our C field is 2017 for the publishing date. Now in this example down here, we have a 264. It is published in Boston. The colon is the same. Publisher is not identified. So this is when a place just isn't listed anywhere and you can't find any information about the publishing house. A lot of older records that I see, or a lot of older items will have this on the record, publisher not identified, but we know that it was published in 2010. And down here we can see that the 264 subfield 4 solely talking about copyright date, and then is followed by subfield C for 2002 and the copyright symbol. On a lot of audiobooks, we will see this P in a circle, 1983, for example, and that's still applicable. And then also spelled out copyright 2005. If, if you want to state that it is the copyright, which, our 4 in the second indicator spot tells us that it's the copyright date, but sometimes those symbols can be tricky to input, so you can always write out copyright 2005. And these examples are pulled from the handbook. Nothing in the chat. So move on to physical description of the item. So what goes into subfield A is the pagination, and I mentioned this already. It is the last page number that is written out. If there's an introduction that has Roman numerals, those will come first, and you will write the Roman numeral that is presented, the last one, followed by the last page number. If and only if there is a subfield B, you're going to have a colon. If there's no subfield B, and we'll talk about what B is for in a minute, you're going to use a semicolon after these page numbers. So subfield B is really about other physical details. If there's a map, if there are illustrations, if there are any kind of thing that you would look at to better describe what the item has with it or in it. And then if you do use this field, then there will come a colon. So kind of if you notice, if there's just an A, colon, if there's an A and a B, you're still getting a colon before moving on to C, which is the height, and you round up in centimeters. For this physical description field, it is repeatable. The indicators don't really carry any data for the following information for the computer to process. And typically you do see A, B, and C. Sometimes B isn't present. In a lot of kids' picture books, there is B illustrations, and you can write black and white in parentheses or color if that's applicable. And C always round up in centimeters. All right, there is a question in the chat. In the 264 field subfield C, why is the date sometimes in brackets and sometimes not? And does it matter? Oh, I should have said up front that brackets play an interesting part in cataloging, in that if you see bracketed information in any field anywhere on a record, that is information that was added at the cataloger's discretion. The cataloger who put the brackets into a record is saying, this is information that I know to be true about an item, but it may not be explicitly stated on an item. If you looked up and saw that the publishing or the copyright is a specific year, you can use brackets and include that year, basically saying that there's good authority enough for the cataloger to state that this is true and accurate information about an item. So that's why you'll see brackets. There was another question. Have you ever seen a misprint or incorrectly printed information? In terms on a MARC record, there are sometimes discrepancies between physical items and MARC records, but typically the MARC record comes from a physical item. You're basing the data that gets input on a specific item that you have in hand. So there really shouldn't be too many mistakes in a record or misprints, but depending on the edition of the item, the run of the print, there could be discrepancies between different items and different records, or how that information appears on a record. Sometimes books get printed where I've seen this like twice, I think, over the last 4 years, where the actual pages of the book have been bound upside down. And usually that like appears in the notes if the book doesn't get sent back. So there are things that can lead to interesting elements of a MARC record that reflect an item. But we really want to focus on the fact that we are cataloging from an item. We're not creating a record without like having the physical item. So it's really based on that. But I mean, there are incorrect printed information all the time, really, in a variety of different ways. I don't know if that answered the question fully, but I think short answer, yes. So for example, with Michael Crichton's Dragon Teeth, we have 300 field description. These are null indicators, meaning no information is stored in that area of this tag. In the A field, there's 295 pages. There's a semicolon. I think maybe that oh, no, we're good. Semicolon if no B, because there's no B, no pictures in this. In subfield C, it's 24 centimeters. Here's an example that does have illustrations. And if something is not, if there are no numerated pages, but you have one book, you can typically say one volume in the A field, or if there's multiple volumes, you can say volumes, or 2 volumes, depending on what the item is, what you're working with, what kind of record you're doing. Notice the colon, illustrations, some color, and then a semicolon. All right, I found an error on my last slide. I will update this. This should be a semicolon is following illustrations. Semicolon comes at the end of your pagination if you're going on to C. And once again, this is so the computer understands, okay, that set of information is done, new information, which it's getting that from the subfield indicator as well, but punctuation is going to matter. And once again, rounded up centimeters. All right. Now, these are things that come from RDA talking specifically about what type of material we're engaging with. So 336, 337, and 338 all have very similar rules about their subfields, about their indicators. The indicators in all 3 of these cases are null. There's no information tied to that area of the field. Your subfield code is where the term is going to show up. And then typically you'll just see a 2 with a source. We'll look at examples. But when it comes to the content type, typically this means what is the content of the item. So we'll look at some examples first. Okay, most frequently used, text. Text is the content of a book. Or 2-dimensional moving image. That would be a movie. Once again, the language sometimes is a little antiquated, but it's what's agreed on for the moment. So 2-dimensional moving image is for a video. If you were cataloging a video, the content type would be 2-dimensional moving image. If it's an audiobook, it's going to be spoken word. So the content type is just a way to think about what is the content, the form of what you're cataloging, the material. Form of communication through which a work is expressed is how LOC defines the content. When it comes to the media type, it's the general type of intermediation device required to view, play, run, etc., the content of a resource. So if it's text, You don't need an intermediation device, meaning there's not really anything required. I mean, someone may need glasses, someone may need a magnifying glass, but for the most part, it's going to be unmediated. There isn't something that is required to play or engage with the content, which is text. When it comes to a video, you want to state that the media type is video. It's a two-dimensional moving image. It's a video. Uh, you will need something to be able to play video, and that's what that means when you see media type video. You're going to need an intermediation device that'll play video. And then if you have an audiobook, you'll see audio, which if you have a DVD, sometimes media type will be repeated twice, and you'll have an audio in there, just stating that, hey, there's also an audio component. You're going to need something that will play audio to interact with this material. And the last one of these is carrier type. This is the format of the storage medium and housing of a carrier in combination with the media type. So most frequently used for a book is a volume. The text is contained in a volume and it's unmediated. You don't need anything to interact with it. If it's a movie, it might be on a video disc. A video disc has two-dimensional moving image. That is a video, and you'll need something to play that video to engage with the material. If it's an audiobook on CD, it is audio on an audio disc that will require a intermediate device in order to play that audio. So those three fields are kind of what makes an RDA record stand out as an RDA record, because it's being really specific about what the actual content of the material is in order to engage with it, in order to interact with it. Okay, so here's an example for our physical book. The content type, it's a text. And there is a computer code for that as well. And you can see here that the source of this term is from the RDA content. 337 is the media type. Again, the indicators are null. It is unmediated. You do not need anything to interact with the text, and it's housed in a volume. That really just means it's in a book. It's a book. You probably don't need anything to play it or engage with it because it's text. So you'll see all three of those kind of grouped together, just as another way to describe what it is you're cataloging. Okay, there's a question in the 337 field, should large print be used? That is a great example. I want to answer that now. So let me pull up, let's see, 337. Microsoft does this thing where it doesn't share my screen automatically. So I'm going to share the handbook here. Okay, terms and codes list for RDA media types. If it's unmediated, it's just going to have text. There is no large print designation in that field because large print is still a form of text. All right, how do I stop sharing this? Okay, good. Cool, so thank you for that question. Turns out it doesn't get that specific in that field. But in the regular 300, I believe you can say large print, or sometimes in the publishing information, it says large print. It kind of depends on the item. I'm also wondering if on the title page, it might state large print. Depends on the item, but that's a great question. All right, moving on to the summary, an optional field, but really good to have, especially if you have a lot of users of the catalog, of the OPAC, that want to know what a book is about without having to go to the shelf or read the back of the book or do a separate Google search to see what the book is about. So 520 is that field for a summary. And the level of detail appropriate in a summary may vary depending on the audience for a particular product. So you probably won't have a child looking for the summary of a picture book. So picture books may not require a summary, but if you think about a parent searching for a picture book and wanting to know the summary, it might be a good thing to include. So it's really cataloger's discretion for that. And so for our indicators for the summary, and once again, this is a repeatable field, which is interesting. You know, you could get a summary from a publisher and you could also get a summary off of Goodreads. Depends. And these summaries are just going to be listed in the subfield code A. That is where the summary goes. Let's look at an example right here. So sometimes you'll see a subfield C, which will state where the summary was gotten from. Sometimes it's from the publisher. Like I said, sometimes it's off of Amazon, sometimes it's off of Goodreads. Depending on where you get it from, you could include that information, but no indicators, just subfield A, and then paste it in there. And sometimes I've seen quotation marks around the summary. Don't think it's necessary. I think you can just paste it in there plain text, just as you would, and that'll show up in the catalog, which can be really helpful for users. All right, subject access fields. This is the 650. And all of the 600 fields contain subject access entries and terms. Most of these fields contain subject added entries or access terms based on the lists and authority files identified in the second indicator. So we're going to be doing a session on subject headings in a couple weeks, I think 2 weeks. And we're going to talk all about different lists and authority files, aka controlled vocabulary, so that only specific words will be used to pull up content and to link things within the catalog. It gets rid of synonyms that way, which is really helpful, streamlines. Ideally, on a good record, you're going to have 3 of these. That way you can cover different topics, different elements of the subjects presented within the book. So a 650 isn't going to speak to like what the content is. It's going to talk about what the content is about. So if it's, I like to use the example of an autobiography. It's an autobiography. If it's someone talking about themselves, the author could appear also in the 600 as a personal name subject, but I forgot where I was going with that example, so apologies for that. But let me get back on track. Ideally, there are 3 of them. Let's go over, but this is repeatable, ideally 3. The first indicator is most commonly going to be a 0. You're not specifying the level of which the subject appears in the item. Honestly, realistically, catalogers would not have the time to read something in order to find out how much of the subject actually appears in the content of the book. So typically, no level specified is fine to use. Your second indicator most typically is going to be like Library of Congress subject headings, but it could also be a 7, source specified in subfield 2. So if you notice, I've underlined 7 and 2 in red because these are linked. If there is a 7 in the second indicator slot, there will be a subfield 2 stating what controlled vocabulary you're using to put a term into subfield A. And then there are also subject subdivision portions that you can add, which is like further specifying the subject and how it appears in the book. If something is fiction, if something also talks about another subject, that can go into, I think, either an X is for like another topic, where V is for more like a genre type term. But the important thing to remember about this is that you really should be using some kind of controlled vocabulary if you're going to add 650 subject headings. An example here. Okay, so all of these second indicators are 0, which means that these are all from Library of Congress subject headings. That's the controlled vocabulary. Notice there's no subfield 2 because it's implied by using a second indicator of 0 that it is from that source. So A is the main subject, and then V is fiction, letting your user know that this book is about dinosaurs, but it's fictional. And there's a lot more to the 650 field. I'll just say that there's a lot more that can be used in terms of specifying the geography of of a subject, the chronology, like what year the book takes place in, all of that kind of stuff. And we'll get into that in 2 weeks from now. So if that's something you're interested in, please check that out. We're going to talk about copy cataloging now. We've gone through, those are kind of the basic fields that you want to be able to say, yep, that's present. Okay, that's a good record that I can use and download into my library system to be able to use it and attach my item to. But when you're copy cataloging, if you're going to change anything about a record, if you're going to add any information, make an edit, make a change, you're going to want to put into the subfield D of the numerical tag 40 your institution code for your library or the consortium code, depending on what your rules are if you're in the consortiums. You can repeat the D field as many times as necessary. And this really tracks, who's editing the content of this record. So it's really important for collaborative and cooperative cataloging that, and if you don't know what your code is, please ask, the consortium heads, or you can use this handy link here, which is also on the syllabus. I'll send that out if you don't have it yet, to find out what your institution code is. Okay, so that was fast, a lot of information coming at you about the ISBN field, which is 020, a little bit about the institution code that you'll need to add if and only if you edit anything about a record. We talked about the author and where that goes in field 100, the title going in the 245 field, publishing and copyright information in 264, height and page number goes into 300, and then those different RDA types in the 336, 337, and 338. Optional 520 summary field. We got a little bit into subject headings. 3 650s should be present. And if there are other contributors, those can go in the 700 field. So basically, when you're copy cataloging, you should really check for all of these boxes in red. If they're present, they're probably going to be reliable. And you'll know that that's a record that you can use. If If the information that's presented in these fields is accurate to what you have in your hand, you're good to go. Here is what the full record for dragon teeth looks like that we've been using and talking about. A lot of highlighted little bits, a lot of gobbledygook perhaps, but maybe it's a little bit clearer now that we've gone through each field briefly, and there's more examples in the MARC 21 handbook. There's a question in the chat that says, in the 100 field, or the 600, personal names must have an authority record in the LC. Is that correct? If you want to add contributors that do not have authority records, where can they be included? All right, first part of the question, yeah, it's always best to present any kind of name in the most uniform, agreed upon way as possible. And the Library of Congress has a name authority database. It's pretty easy to use, and it'll give you any information about dates and whatnot on a specific person if you are inputting that data into a record. Now, if I had found a record that maybe didn't have Michael Crichton's dates per se, and if I was, trying to get the book on the shelf, I may not take the time to see if that's accurate. That's probably not the best use of your time. Uh, it's a little bit of a time depends situation, as a lot of these cataloging questions are. But for the most part, if you're doing a personal name, it is always best to make sure that you're using what is in the Library of Congress name authority, so that it's specific and can be tied throughout the catalog and throughout the shared network of libraries, that a name is presented in the same way. So if you wanted to add a contributor that do not have an authority record, where can they be included? So you can add an illustrator's name if they don't have an authority record. I've been doing some original cataloging for some very old materials, and I have been surprised by what's in the Library of Congress name authority already. But if there isn't a name authority, which is rare, it can still be included in the 100 or the 600 if it's subject, or the 700 if they're a contributor in another way. So especially if it kind of comes down to a time crunch or getting an item out to someone, and you don't have time to make sure you're using the proper LC, you always just want to go, what is on the material? How does the name appear on the title page? That's that. I feel like that's authority enough. And I also don't want to underestimate the importance of the publication verso page. That can have a lot spelled out for you very easily. It can have subject headings. It can have the author's name properly listed. It can show you exactly how to put in the title. So that's always a quick, good place to look if you don't have time to use a database to make sure you're getting a name right. I hope that answers the question. Yeah, it's pretty rare that they don't have an authority record. But, if you're just trying to add a contributor in a 700 field, just go ahead and write how it's presented in the book, but with that same convention of last name, comma, first name. All right, so more about copy catalog. Said before, deciphering the best option is really what copy cataloging comes down to. Okay, there is a question in the chat that I want to address. How about authors whose names have changed over time? This is a great question, and it was really relevant on the listserv, I want to say last month maybe, about an author who has had a name change. And the Library of Congress does have a dedicated team of people who update and make sure that their authority records and headings are accurate. So I believe the example that was used, I can't think of the person's name, but I did go into the database and I had seen that it was in fact updated. So basically, the rule of thumb for that situation is that in the 245 field for the title, that subfield C, where you write the author's name as it appears on the title page, if you have a book that is by someone who has changed their name after the book was published, you're going to put whatever is written on that title page, even if it might be their dead name, into the subfield C, but in the 100, you're going to write the updated authority name, which might be their new name that they've changed it to. It's a little bit of a maybe like moral or ethical, depending on who you are, challenge situation. But that's proper practice. Yeah. So great questions. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. All right. So copy cataloging. Copy cataloging saves time, but you have to ask yourself what fields are present. Is this the correct addition to what I have in my hand? And generally, you can kind of tell if it's the exact copy, if the publication date is the same, and if the pages are the same. Those are two really quick ways to justify using a record. And then another question to ask yourself, are there fixable errors in this record that I'm looking at? Are there maybe some discrepancies, but that are easily changed that I can use this record? There is a flow chart in the syllabus, which I'll pull up in a minute, perhaps. We have about 20 minutes left of our session today. But good copy cataloging also requires you to know your ILS, your integrated library system. You need to know how to be able to upload a record into your ILS, which every ILS kind of has a different process. Same with original cataloging. What is presented to you is going to look differently. So you really have to look into what ILS you're using, and what the process for doing any of this is. I'm always happy to answer specific questions, but there are some things that I just will not know how to do, which you may have to consult your manual on how to do that, or someone in the consortium. Oh, here's the flow chart here, a simplified version of what's in the syllabus. You have an item in your hand, you're going to check your catalog for it. Typically, you're going to use the ISBN number because that's specific enough, and we'll pull up a record for that item. You can also use the built-in Z39.5 ILS search. So that's something that typically is already in your system, and you have the ability to reach out to other catalogs, in the United States or even worldwide, depending on what ILS you have and what options you have in order to like toggle on how far your search reaches. So basically, that search is going to go out to other libraries and pull in what might be a good option for you. And in each of these steps, it's do I have what I need? Yes. Okay, pull it in, add your item, or no, let's check another resource. So the next resource that's good to check is the Library of Congress catalog, which there's a link for that there. And that will give you pretty good record to use. There's also the ability to check the Clover, what's used for ILL, interlibrary loan in the state. And April Shaw has put together a really nice tutorial about how to download a record from Clover, and then you can upload it into your system. This is really nice for example, the microphones that the state has shared out with different libraries in the state. You'd be able to go into Clover. You will need credentials, but sure just ask your interlibrary loan person if they can help you, or reach out to April Shaw to get set up with that. And you can download the record and then upload it and add your items to it. And that's a really nice way. And Vermont has so much Vermont specific material that might be present on Clover and potentially nowhere else. Although Library of Congress is a good place to search, and I've always had good luck with the Z39 search within the ILS. There's also the option of checking Cat Express. The state pays for a certain amount of record downloads. If you're not part of the program, we usually add people to the system in around August or the summertime. There will be things on the listserv about that process. And so that is also an option for copy cataloging. And once again, you really need to know your integrated library system, your ILS, to be able to upload those things and then add items to them. All right. Just want to reiterate that copy cataloging comes down to being able to recognize if these things are present and if they're accurate. All right, we have another question about the name situation. I love this. All right, the question is, what about authors who are independently published and may not be listed in the name authority database, I'm assuming? Can their name be listed in the 100 field? Yes. Yep. If there's a name present on the title page, you can definitely input what you see. Just use the convention, last name, comma, first name. All right, how are we doing on time? We are at 11:15. I will make a plug now for the other events that are coming up this month over Microsoft Teams. Next Wednesday, we're going to do an advanced cataloging session. So getting to some fields that we didn't talk about today. And then, as I mentioned, 2 weeks from now, we're going to do a subject heading session. Talking about some current events and some best practices, and also some history about subject headings in the library catalog. And then on Wednesday, February 22nd, we're going to be talking about cataloging non-traditional materials. So this is for things that are commonly found in the Library of Things, which more and more libraries are getting those. But that also means that there are catalogers who are saying, how do I catalog snowshoes? So we'll go over questions like that. And I encourage people to bring examples, bring their own questions, or bring successes. Let us know what's working and how things are being cataloged. And then I'm also wanting to extend an invite to everyone here that there will be a Vermont cataloging roundtable. We're going to start those this month. They'll be on the last Tuesday of every month. Depending on availability and success, we're looking at 10 to 11:30. Just come meet, share questions, concerns, cataloging conundrums, or successes. We can discuss, Vermont specific topics or just cataloging in general. We may use a different ILS, but we can still share what's happening in our VT cataloging community. So please send me an email if you're interested, and if you have ideas for what we want to talk about, I'm happy to put an agenda together with those things. That's my plug for that. But I want to open it up for more questions. Sorry. Okay. Please, maybe I'll just stop sharing. And if anyone has a question, we can discuss. Before I open it up, I will say that there is a survey about today's session that I'll send out along with the recording and the syllabus and the slides. I'll send those out again as well. Please reach out to me if there's ever any questions, or even if there's something you don't understand or want more clarification on. My email is there. It's just my name. I see that Debbie has a hand. Go for it, Debbie.
I don't seem to have chat in my Teams, but I had a quick thing back to the 245 and indicator 1. if you
Yeah.
have if you have something that's got editors instead of an author, the editor doesn't go in the 100. They should be in the 700 on the editors.
Okay.
And then that
Perfect.
item becomes what they call a title entry, as opposed to, you know, an author entry, or the main entry instead of being an author is the title. And in that case, you would have a 0 for no added entry because it's already entering it under the title. So just wanted to clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel like with the editors, with things that are having editors as the main contributors, it's always a little bit of like, okay, how exactly do I do this? And what then becomes the proper indicators.
Right. Well, this is a
Thank you for that,
change
Debbie.
between AACR2
Yeah,
and RDA, because you used to put like the first editor's name in and then the other editors in the 700. And with RDA, you
Yeah.
don't use the editors at all and as the 100.
No editors at all. Awesome.
Another difference people might see between AACR2 and RDA is that AACR2, because in the early days of computers, storage space was at a premium. And so they had something they called the rule of 3, where only the first 3 contributors or editors were listed in the cataloging record. And with RDA, because, you know, there's the cloud can hold everything. So now all the editors and contributors are shared and, you know, listed in the 700.
Awesome.
So if you ever hear about the rule of 3, it's no longer valid.
Perfect. Okay, are there other questions or things that people want to address? Let me check the chat. Will you provide us the changes that you both are discussing in RDA? That's a good question. I don't know if I've come across a specific resource that has every change listed out. I know that there are specific resources about specific like groups of elements. Like there is one that talks about the different changes between 260 to 264. But I don't know if Debbie, you don't know of any.
I may have a cheat
resources, do
sheet.
you?
I'm just kind of looking through here. I'll take a look and
Yeah.
see. You know, it's RDA came in 13 years ago now, so I don't think that's been
Yeah.
updated in a long time. And I don't know that it lists every single change, but it's kind of
Yeah.
a cheat sheet for differences between AACR2 and RDA. And when I find that, Lauren, I'll scan it and send it to you.
Perfect. I would love to
disseminate it.
see that myself. Yeah, and we can get that out there. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I know that there are definitely resources for like specific changes, but maybe not the one-stop shop. Well, if there are no more questions or clarifications, I'm happy to let people go early. Oh, there is another question. Someone's asking, for a collection of short stories, what would go in the 100 field? The editor? So if there is a collection of short stories and there's no, one author, you may not have a 100 field. And like we said before, there's 90% of fields won't be used in every record, and a 100 may not be applicable for a specific item. As Debbie had reiterated, the editor can go in 700. And if there's multiple editors, we can list those all in 700. And in that case, there would not be a 100 field. So, there are always exceptions to the rule. Basically, the fields we went over today, you're going to see them a lot, but sometimes they won't be present. They won't be applicable. It really depends on the item in hand. Yeah. Thanks for that example. All right, if I'm happy to answer more questions. if there aren't any more, thank you for joining us today. I hope to see you again. And if there's any other questions that come up, please shoot me an email or get in touch. But yeah, thank you all. I'm happy to stick around for the next 7 minutes, answer more questions, or you're free to go.